NBA ratings are down, and there are a lot of speculative theories as to why people aren't watching games that I think are significant contributing factors. But I think there's one overarching reason that isn't being talked about. But before we get to that, let's go through two articles, starting with the Yahoo Sports article on the screen with me, because we have a quote from Bill Simmons, and then we also have a reason cited by Ethan Strauss. So Ethan Strauss is a sports and culture writer, and what he gets at is that players aren't playing hard enough. There's not enough effort. And then if we scroll down further, we have Bill Simmons, and Bill Simmons says there is too much inventory. So, quote, there's too much of it and it's too available. There's nothing special about it. All right. And then so if we tab over to this front office sports article, we see some more theories thrown out. So, style of play. So, there are too many 3 pointers being shot. Players get away with traveling too often. Load management, star players not playing, star players injured or resting. The season is too long. ESPN broadcasts not good enough, so broadcasts not being entertaining. NBA politics and wokeness getting in the way of enjoying the game. I think these can all be contributing factors. But there's a Reddit comment that comes really close to what I'm thinking of. And this comment reads, ratings of everything are dropping and have been. Every show, every sport, every bit of video content. People used to only have access to a few options for media consumption, a handful of TV channels. There are now thousands and thousands of options. So this is very close, but I think it's missing the even bigger picture. It's not just media options, it's all options. It's not just that people are watching different channels or different social media platforms or whatever the case is. It's that people are doing everything. There are so many options everywhere, both online and in the physical world, that people's interests have been spread out and they've spread thinner. And so, in effect, what's happening is that the NBA, among so many other things, is being displaced by other interests. So, time is finite. So, people can only consume so many things. Even if there is a genuine interest in the NBA, we see this displacement happening. And this displacement coincides with a societal shift and I think, I'm trying to think of the word, not a personality shift, but a behavioral shift because people are behaving different. One way is that we have less of an attention span. So we're just not going to pay attention to something for as long as we used to. And if we do, it's much harder to retain that attention. But along with that, there's the societal shift that people now have all of these different competing interests, and it's just there's not enough time for the NBA. Whereas in decades or even years previous, the number of interests just wasn't as large. So even just going back 5 years, there were less competing interests. But if we go back further and further, there just weren't as many things to do. So I think there are so many different contributing factors to this, but the biggest one is just that people are behaving differently and that the number of options has increased to such a degree that it's not really the NBA's fault. And yet the NBA keeps trying to figure this out as if there's some move that they have that's going to change the way that people are behaving. And it's not changing one thing or another. In fact, I think the NBA's constant guesswork is actually working against them and could be cited as another contributing factor. I don't think it's a matter of having the NBA Cup, which, by the way, that gets at the other problem that the NBA has is that the players themselves aren't really showing as much dedication and focus to the game. So, of course, that would be a contributing factor as well. So, the NBA's got problems coming from both the product side and the viewership side. But from the viewership side, uh, it's you see these problems and they're stacking, and the NBA's in a way, and sometimes some compounding the problem because they keep trying to guess what the right answer is, and I don't think there's a one right answer. And I think with these contributing factors, I don't think it's just one or another or a few. I think it's everything stacked when stacked together, it just results in people aren't going to be watching as many games. And one thing the NBA has to think about is it may be doing a lot of things right. There may be a lot of things going on that are right with the NBA, but it's just not enough to overcome everything else that the NBA is competing with, which is not just other sports, but with all other interests. As I said, time is finite. So when people start looking at their priorities, let's just say the NBA is a low to mid tier priority, which isn't bad when you consider the hierarchy of how many things people have to keep track of. Let's say their work, let's say their relationships, let's say their kids. The NBA is falling lower on that hierarchy, but that's not a problem. But when other things start moving up, it starts to displace the NBA. So whereas even if they have a passing interest, the NBA is just not going to be something that they consume as much of. So they're just not going to be watching games as they traditionally once were. And that's why I think we still see a lot of interest in NBA centric topics. It's just not that you're seeing the direct viewership to the game. So I think it's a lot of reasons why that are a lot of things that are contributing to the NBA's decline in viewership. And I would say that the NBA needs to stop changing the game and stop trying to guess at what needs to be altered or adjusted. It's not a matter of altering or adjusting anything. It's just a matter of accepting the reality that people are not going to watch the entire game like they once were. It's just not that those days are not going to come again, no matter what the NBA comes up with. But I do think that the NBA has contributed to its own downfall, to its own decline. And I say downfall, that's hyperbolic. We haven't seen a downfall of the NBA, but we have seen a decline in viewership. And the NBA has contributed to that because for a while they were successful in spite of themselves, which is something that will come up more on this channel. But you can be successful in spite of yourself. But after a while, the market usually takes that success in spite of yourself, and it will take the success away because someone else will shore up that gap that you are leaving there. And I think with the NBA, they were successful and they took that success for granted. And we had a lot of the erosion of the quality of product of the NBA. So some of the things that were already talked about include the style of play, the traveling, the referees inconsistency, referee bad calls, the long delays in the game, which are still there, the half times, which are you don't even need to watch them. There's no point in watching the halftime. So the event at the beginning, the networks were looking at they were looking in the short term and they were just thinking, well, let's just cram commercials in here because we've still got people's attention. So let's go ahead and have like mostly filler and just a little bit of halftime show. Well, what ended up happening is people just decided, well, I don't need the filler altogether. And now you can just imagine someone possibly keeping the show on, but not watching the actual commercials, which is going to dilute that time anyway, that airtime anyway. But people aren't watching the commercials now. They're just going to stop at halftime and then they're going to come back after a certain amount of time because they don't care that much. And they don't even care if they miss the start of the third quarter, but no one's going to sit there and watch 20 minutes, which are, let's say, 80% commercials. So I think that's one of the ways where the NBA and the NBA's presentation help contribute to its downfall. It's like there are so many things, and at first you can take them for granted because your product is just so overpowering and so powerful that it's still captivating people. But after a while, if you start stacking on those negatives, then eventually it will water down the product and people will just start leaving it. And so the NBA has had many of these instances where the focus is not on basketball, where we see the stars starting to be rested. That's when Greg Popovich started to realize that I can maximize this team's chances of winning in the playoffs without actually playing the star players that many games, because really we just need to make sure that we get into the playoffs with a decent seed We don't really need to pay attention to winning. We saw the focus on it being championship or nothing, which is extremely bad for the league, because if every team deems not winning the championship, or at least the teams that are, let's say, playoff caliber teams, if every team deems the season a failure if they don't win the championship, that's a real problem, because that means the rest of the season is pointless, basically, and that most of the teams aren't really playing for anything, and so there's really no reason to watch. That contributed. There's so many things where obviously the games with the cheating and the referees and the scandals, that contributed. All of these things start to chip away at the product, to where at some point you start to see the roller coaster start to go down, just because everything starts to add up. And when you get enough of these negatives, even if they're just micro negatives at the time, they really start to stack, and then you don't have what you once had. And now I think the NBA is contributing to this by trying to change, by trying to adapt. And we saw adaptations and changes earlier. One being that David Stern actually shortened the 3-point line, which was always a huge mistake, because when you start to tamper with the game, you start to tamper with the history and the statistics. This is very short term thinking. And when it comes back and you look in hindsight, you can see that a lot of these changes, for example, one season, they changed the ball, they switched out the ball, and then it resulted in worse quality play because the ball was so off and the players weren't used to it. So they cheapened the ball. That came back to where they had to switch it. We've now seen the playoff format change. I'm not sure. I'm not certain that the playoff format change uh, to having additional teams that could potentially make the play in is a good idea. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Um, I don't. I don't really think the midseason tournament now, the NBA Cup, is that compelling. But you can argue for or against these things. Maybe some of the changes have worked out well, but I think a lot of times what's happening is the NBA is guessing and checking, and you really shouldn't be guessing and checking with an established sports league, because as I said, it tampers with the history and it changes statistics, it changes outcomes, and we've seen even last season, we've seen in several seasons where the refereeing has changed and dramatically altered the results of the games. And I'm talking about how the games are played and how many points are being scored. That's changed, right? So we used to see games with lower scoring, then the NBA wanted higher scoring. And then I don't remember if it was last season or the season before, then the NBA realized, oh, this is bad. We need to make it so that players can't draw fouls just by falling down. And so I think that's been another huge problem for the NBA, is with especially in the James Harden era at its height, you had players that were just drawing fouls that weren't even fouls. So you had to watch free throws all the time. So many contributing factors to why the game would start to alienate people. And so I think with the NBA, you have to get back to the essence of what this is basketball, and accept the fact that you're not going to be able to have the viewership, the traditional viewership that you once had. So I think what this will come down to is accepting that, yes, we will get social media interest and we'll get more people watching the highlights, and then trying to better monetize that micro attention, that micro viewership, because the micro viewership is still there. And I think the interest is still there. But what's not there is this ability to capture people for multiple hours at a time for dozens of games a year. That's just unrealistic and not going to happen. But I do think there are many adjustments that can be made to in-game play, especially with replays taking so long. I think baseball has started to realize this, and basketball does too. You can't just have people sitting there waiting on you for minutes at a time to figure things out. This isn't the old days. People just don't have that attention span, and they don't have that time, and they're going to move on, and they're going to look to other things. And if they start to let's just call it change the channel, then they might not come back. And if they do, they might miss several minutes of gameplay. So a lot of contributing factors. I've named several off the top of my head, But I think the biggest one is a societal shift. People are behaving differently, people are thinking differently. And because of this, I think a lot of the decline in the viewership isn't necessarily the NBA's fault now, but over time, the NBA has certainly contributed to its decline in viewership.